use our access authority on a case.
All right, you guys, can y'all hear me?
Yeah. I mean, it was literally...
Happy afternoon. We are in the PM lull, so I hope everybody got a snack and is paying attention.
And I was like, oh, damn.
We should have a QR code coming up on screen. It'll take you to a handout we've got for this session, but we are here today for disability inclusion and disasters, working towards meaningful access and recovery for all. My name is Stephanie Duke, she, her, hers. I am a tall, slender, Caucasian female, middle-aged, short, salt and pepper hair. I am the attorney and disability resilience coordinator at Disability Rights Texas. I am also a member of the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services team, a former Equal Justice Works Disaster Resilience Program Fellow, and a Disaster Recovery Corps Fellow. I'm also the current chair for Texas volunteer organizations active in disasters, and I work with the State Bar of Texas Disaster Legal Aid Task Force. So my world is everything disaster and emergency related, dealing with the disability population. Today, I am here as your moderator for this session, and I will start with Jordan's introduction.
Thank you. So my name is Jordan Davis. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her. I'm a staff attorney, also Equal Justice Works Disaster Resilience Fellow at Disability Rights California. So I'm based out of Oakland, and I primarily work on wildfire disasters, but now we're having a lot of winter storms and flooding, so it's shifting a little bit. And for my visual description, I am a Black woman with wearing glasses, and my hair are in long braids.
Cool. Hey y'all, I am Brian Russell. I am the Emergency Management Coordinator with Disability Rights Florida. I'm also a recovering Department of Health employee. After years of being in public health, I finally jumped ship and came over to Disability Rights Florida. Pronouns are him, her, him, he, him, his. Visual description, Caucasian, middle-aged-ish, white guy with a little bit of hair left. 3 dogs and an 18-year-old will do this real quickly. So I am, like I said, the EM coordinator with Disability Rights Florida. My role is making sure that people with disabilities and their families and caregivers have access to everything they need to prepare for, deal with, and recover from whatever disaster we're facing in Florida, be it hurricanes, wildfires, man-made, or natural disasters. Prior to that, I was the disability and health manager with Florida Department of Health, and working within public health, COVID response, and other disaster responses as well.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey y'all, my name is Sarah Bacot. I am an Equal Justice Works Disaster Resilience Fellow with Disability Rights Louisiana in New Orleans. I work primarily on hurricanes, but actually a lot of my cases these days are COVID related. So there's that. In addition to individual work, direct services work, I do some work trying to build more systemic disaster resilience and equitable disaster resilience in Louisiana.
All right, thank you guys. I don't know if y'all caught it, but we are all employees of the disability rights within our respective states, and we just happen to cover coast to coast. So, how many of y'all have heard of the protection and advocacy system? Yay, I see some hands that I know I've educated on. So for those that don't know, the protection and advocacy system, or the P&A, is actually a network of state agencies that work to ensure individuals' rights and civil liberties are upheld across a variety of domains. We actually are federally funded. Well, some of us, some other ones have more state funding than others, but it all started with an investigation from Willowbrook State School in 1972, which Geraldo Rivera actually did. We won't say anything about his previous career, but it led to, unfortunately, the realization of the egregious treatment of individuals with disabilities. And at that time, that setting was the biggest housing congregate setting of people with disabilities. So it led to lawsuits, it led to federal funding that stemmed a lot of different opportunities to ensure that people with disabilities rights were upheld. So that's how we kind of got started. We are not actually a governmental entity. We're kind of the watchdog to make sure people are doing what they're supposed to. So we all work in disaster emergency related areas. So the first thing we want to kind of address on is individuals with disabilities have rights, right? They're afforded civil rights and civil liberties under American with Disabilities Act, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and in addition to any non-discriminatory obligations and all kinds of other things. But first we want to talk about is what is meaningful access. And, you know, meaningful access is something that it's a term of art, but it also ensures people have equitable opportunities. So, Brian, I'm going to pitch this to you first to start us off.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Stephanie. As far as, kind of what we're looking at as far as meaningful access, it's not just what the ADA or the Americans with Disabilities Act states as physical access. You know, can you physically get into a building? That's great. That's important. But let's say you're going to your county health department and you're in a wheelchair and they're offering a diabetes prevention course, okay? Well, if all you need is physical access into the building, well, then they'll have that. But if you're deaf or hard of hearing, if you're blind or visually impaired, if you have an intellectual developmental disability and you need assistance understanding the curriculum, well, then just getting into the building's not access enough. That's not going to do you any good if you can't comprehend and complete that prevention program. So meaningful access also is programmatic access. It's, as it relates to emergency management, emergency preparedness and recovery, it's things like getting access to a shelter, whether it's a general population shelter or a special needs shelter. We're Florida, sorry. We're Florida.
We'll hit on that a little bit later.
Yeah. But so it's physically getting into the shelter. One of the issues that we had during Hurricane Michael was when Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle, we had cases of families of autistic children sleeping in their cars outside of the shelter because the shelter was too much for their kids. And we, at the time, unfortunately, did not have a response for that. We didn't know how to plan and prepare for that and resolve that issue. During Hurricane Dorian, we did. We were able to get sensory kits into shelters pre-storm, pre-landfall. So shelters had sensory kits and sensory items for that. But that's an example of access. Another issue is communications access. If you're someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, and you are you've understood that there is a storm coming, but so you turn on the TV and there's no ASL interpreter at the press conference, or even worse, there is an ASL interpreter, but he is interpreting gibberish because he's a lifeguard and his brother is deaf, so the local EM director said, "Hey, Bill, your brother's deaf. Come over and sign." That happened in Florida, by the way. Google bad ASL interpretations, and it happened in Florida during Irma, I believe. So there's that programmatic access of not able to understand because you don't have an ASL interpreter. You've also got other communications needs. Other meaningful access would be if you're someone with a disability who requires assistance with daily living or a caregiver, and your caregivers can't come to the shelter for whatever reason. If your PCA cannot access the shelter, then who's responsible for taking care of your needs? So those are just some of the issues that we've had with meaningful access, during our disasters.
Thanks, Brian. Jordan, do you have anything to add to that as far as meaningful access and what that means?
Yeah, I wanted to also add that meaningful access looks like meeting people where they're at. So you're not coming into these communities as the authority, as the one who's there just to solve their problems. It's more of uplifting their voices and working with these populations on the issues because they're the expert, right? They know what they need most. And so we're here to just bring our strategy, our resources, our money to help folks, and realizing that those communities are also going to have maybe different structures of how they do their decision making, how they lead their meetings. So just really coming in and not thinking that you know how things should be run and how things should go, but working with how they already flow for those folks, that's going to make it actually meaningful and makes it more approachable for folks too, right? If you're coming in there wearing your suit and you're the one who knows everything, those people don't want to talk to you. They don't feel comfortable. They've already been traumatized, and they just want to talk to somebody who is just going to understand and listen, and then try to work with them on their resources and their needs.
Thanks, Jordan. Sarah, anything?
Yeah, I guess I would also add that meaningful access is really location specific and dependent, right? So I live in New Orleans, which is a beautiful city with well-known infrastructure issues. There are active social media accounts dedicated to the potholes of New Orleans. And the one at the end of my street is seasonally decorated. You can fit a small Christmas tree inside of it, right? There are beautiful live oaks which tear up the sidewalks. So if you are someone with mobility issues and you need to use the sidewalk, and a beautiful tree has made it unnavigable, and you go try to use the street and the 15 potholes there make it unnavigable, what exactly are you supposed to do? And that's only exacerbated post-storm when things are further torn up. So if you're trying to reach a FEMA assistance site to fill out an application, how are you going to get there, right? Historical landmarks are also a huge thing in New Orleans. Again, it's a beautiful city, and people get very up in arms when you talk about making things accessible, which is very annoying because the law does require that you make things accessible to the maximum extent feasible. And that means sometimes in historical buildings, you can't do what you would do in a new building, but that doesn't mean you don't have to think creatively about how to make sure that you create an accessible space. So, for us, that's meant speaking with folks, particularly, even lawyers, about what it might mean to think about, you have a 2-story office, why can you not offer these services on the first floor? It does not make that much of a difference to create a ramp entryway into the first floor to make sure you have an accessible restroom there. Disability Rights Louisiana, where I work, there's a public library not far from where we are that's beautiful, historical. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating it and did not make it accessible. So obviously we had to go back. And they fixed that, right? They added a wheelchair lift, and they made the shelves further apart so it's navigable. The restrooms are now accessible. But, the thought that it's a historical landmark, we're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating it, but not for folks with disabilities, that's a huge problem. And so I think looking at the specific circumstances of where you live, the different types of hurdles you might face in terms of structures and infrastructure becomes really important when you're thinking about meaningful access.
Thank you, guys. One of the analogies I like to give so you can, visualize what meaningful access is about, it's not just about the ramp being installed outside or the curb cut. It's to get to the building, right? It's actually what is being offered inside the building, the programmatic, the untangible things that have to be inclusive of the disability population's needs as well to provide that meaningful access, right? It's about creating equitable opportunities. That doesn't mean handouts, that doesn't mean excuses. That means giving them everything that they need to be included in whatever participation or process it is. I have a question for you guys. Do you think when people or entities, whoever may have the obligation, are looking to provide ways for meaningful access, is it just they're unaware of how to provide it, or no exposure? Is it kind of all the same thing, or do you really think it's intentional discrimination? Jordan, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think it's really, it's unintentional because we've built a society that's ableist, right? Like, you just don't automatically include or assume that someone may have a disability, especially when it comes to things like invisible illnesses. You know, I may have a chronic illness. You're not going to know that just looking at me, but that definitely impacts my life and how I can function in a society that's not set up for me or other people like me who have physical disabilities and then also, you know, chronic illness. So yeah, I don't think it's really intentional. It's just that it's not in the mainstream enough that it's something that people just automatically think about in their work the way that we do working at disability rights organizations.
Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with Jordan and Stephanie. I think overall it is unintentional. In one case, where, well, you know, thinking of like with ASL interpreters, a lot, you know, many times, and I've had these conversations with PIOs and emergency managers on the local level. They literally just assume that closed captioning is good enough, or they don't know, you know, or they don't know where they can find an ASL interpreter. So I do think it's just kind of helping them understand, you know, educating them. You know, yes, you can have an ASL interpreter. Here's why it's needed. So I think it's unintentional and just more education, more understanding of ableism and how to combat ableism is needed.
Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I would just add, at a certain point, it can become problematic when folks say things like, I mean, who's actually going to need that? Why do I need to do that? That's going to cost me money. I've never seen person with X or Y. And that is absolutely a pretty overt byproduct of an ableist society, and also, you know, just requires further education and also requires pointing out that there are legal obligations. So to a certain extent, we're not particularly interested in what you do or don't want to do. It is something that needs to be done.
All right, thank you guys. And I think one thing to note too is that our surveillance systems, whether it's public health or any kind of metric being created, even though individuals with disabilities in the disability community has been considered historically an underserved population, they're not included in that data, right? You've got race, you've got age, you've got sex, or gender and sexual orientation even now. But the disability community population has been left out of this. So it is deliberate indifference to not start collecting that data to say, oh, wait, fake out, our response and recovery measures aren't equitable. So how do we fix that? You know, and recognizing that to begin with too. All right, with that being said, we're gonna go on to our next question. In this world, in this space that we work in, we recognize that disasters start and end locally, right? It impacts the geographic area in which you live, you know, even a public health emergency. Federal agencies provide guidance, but like it was mentioned earlier, it is still the obligation of the state and the local jurisdictions to protect people and property from injury and harm. As I just mentioned though, individuals with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by the event. There have been small, but some research done that an individual with disabilities 2 to 4 times more likely to suffer injury or death because of an actual event for different reasons and different variables. And it's because they have been denied an equitable opportunity to participate in or benefit from what happens during or after an event. Now, there was a case mentioned earlier a couple times against the city of San Antonio. Our firm, Disability Rights Texas, has filed that to ensure inclusive planning practices are done at the local levels. We get that the lights are going to go out, that the water may shut off, that you may not have access to things, right? But these plans have to provide alternative choices for people to build that resiliency, right? And so that magic, that happens in planning, blue sky times, steady state times. So my next question to you guys is, what does that look like for y'all? Inclusive planning practices. What do local jurisdictions that are obligated for the general public anyways, but specifically for individuals with disabilities under ADA Title II, to ensure that they have equitable access to response and recovery programs? And let's see. Sarah, let's start with you first on that one.
Great, sure. So I think in New Orleans and Louisiana specifically, after Hurricane Ida, there was a lot of attention drawn to some of the incredibly ugly things that happened after the storm because there was not preparation to take care of folks with disabilities, particularly folks in facilities and elderly folks, and there was a lot. There were deaths, there were injuries, and there was suddenly political pressure to be better. So one of the things that has happened in Louisiana is that one of our state representatives has created a task force to focus specifically on contraflow and sirens. For y'all who maybe haven't experienced it before, contraflow is when usually when there's a hurricane, they'll open both sides of the interstate to evacuate rather than having them go both ways. It is really, really hard to make happen for any number of reasons, including that things need to start being called very, very far out from when the storm happens, and that's a problem. I won't get too deep into contraflow. The point being that as someone from Disability Rights Louisiana, I've started to sit in on, I'm a member of the task force, right? So I think there are community members who are parents of folks with disabilities and advocates for those in their communities with disabilities who are also present on the task force, and so attempt to bring into the conversation consistently, okay, if we're thinking about creating rest stops in contraflow, what are we doing about access and functional needs? What are we doing about folks who have kids with, on the spectrum, who have particular sensory needs, folks who need access to, any number of things, but electricity for whatever it may be. I think ensuring that people are there to have those conversations is really important. The city government has hired someone who I think has a multitude of duties, but one of them is to think about access and functional needs, and he's doing things like inviting organizations to go look at evacuation sites to evaluate them for accessibility, which I think is another thing that's moving in the right direction. And then there are things like, and I think probably we'll all talk a little bit about this, but registries and taking into consideration folks who have disabilities prior to disasters. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to registries. New Orleans used to have the special needs registry, problematic for a number of reasons. They're moving away from that and towards a smart 911 system, which is this sort of system that would allow text messages and alerts to be sent out to folks. The problem, of course, is that doesn't work for everyone. And also, not everyone wants to give all their information to the government for any number of reasons. So I'll just use my client base, for example. I use a lot of physical mail because the folks that I work with don't have consistent access to phones, don't text, don't email. Things move slower. And the people that they're most in contact with are religious organizations in their communities or the people immediately around them. And communication with me takes a really long time. So, assuming that folks are going to have the access that they need to engage in these digital programs is just not always true. And I think something that needs to be thought about more. I will stop there. Yeah.
Brian, go for it.
Thanks. So a couple of things as far as during like a blue sky or a steady state. Some of the things we learned during Hurricane Irma were we had a number of people with disabilities being discharged from shelters by the local shelter management into nursing homes and other facilities because they had nowhere to go. Their homes were destroyed, and it was time to close the shelters because schools have to get back in session. So they were.
So you were saying they were integrated in the community, and they were forced into institutionalization.
Yes, that's correct.
Gotcha.
They were forced into institutionalization. So as a result of that, after Hurricane Irma, one of the things we did was we during during Blue Sky, we stood up and we started creating shelter transition teams to go into the shelters and help facilitate better, more effective transition, more equitable transition, and it was much better. We were able to make sure that people with disabilities had somewhere to go and had plans if their houses were destroyed and couldn't really go back in there, that they had places to go to transition out of that shelter back into an independent, living independently as possible. Another thing we noticed was during Hurricane Michael, we learned that families of kids with autism tend to go to shelters if they have to, but shelters aren't equipped for kids with autism or anyone on the spectrum or adults with intellectual developmental disabilities. So as a result of that, during Blue Sky, we started working with some community partners with our UCEDs, which are University Centers of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. There's one at USF and one at University of Miami. So we worked with the two UCEDs and with University Centers on Autism to create sensory kits. And we were able to get sensory kits into the different, into every county health departments for their special needs shelters. Another thing that we've been working with our local Centers for Independent Living on is connecting the Centers for Independent Living with their local emergency managers to include real people with disabilities in their exercises. So some of y'all may, some of y'all may hear, hey, that there's a disaster exercise at the airport. We're training on how to respond to a plane crash. And a lot of times you'll have someone from, local on, you'll have someone just, act like they're in a wheelchair. They don't really use a wheelchair, but, oh yeah, I'm in a wheelchair now for this exercise. Well, that's not going to teach a first responder how to deal with someone who really uses a wheelchair. So use people with disabilities in these exercises. And we're seeing that more and more now. So that's just a couple of the things that we've been able to do in Blue Sky to prepare for when disasters hit. And I will say it's very important to tell your first responders and exercise participants, hey, this guy really does use a wheelchair. Funny things can happen when they don't realize that.
Jordan?
Yeah, and so the thing I wanted to point out is that it's not a requirement, but it should be, is that people with disabilities need to be also in leadership roles when it comes to emergency planning. We have a great example of that in California. Our California Office of Emergency Services, one of our top people in leadership is a person with actual disability. Because what happens a lot of the time is organizations, they want to include people, but what they'll do is ask you to give your time and your energy to educate them on issues instead of having you in a paid position or at least compensating your time. And I mean, if I'm working, I'm already disabled, I'm tired, and now you want me to come in here and explain to you all the ways that I'm already extra tired because the society is ableist and all that, I probably don't want to. I'm not gonna do that. And so now you just, you're not getting that information that is really important and vital to making sure that it's actually inclusive and you're understanding the different types of disabilities. So not just people with physical disabilities, like you're saying, intellectual and developmental disabilities, blind, hard of hearing, deaf, all of that. They definitely need to be at the table, compensated, and actually in leadership.
I would definitely agree that part of our lawsuit is not just about ensuring equitable outcomes. It's also about us being a partner, right? Public-private partnerships, establishing that and sustaining it to ensure that that process is changed, right? Day-to-day operations are changed. And it's not just like these guys were saying, advisory committees are great, task forces are great, but they're just that. They don't have the political will behind them when it should be ingrained at a position and with that executive level with the authority to make those day-to-day decisions. And until it is, it's not going to be implemented in that planning process that results in the equitable opportunities and the outcomes. So we mentioned registries, and in theory, registries could be a great tool, right? But they're not. States that have them, I think some state has some form of it, in maybe, except for California. They're kind of what we're getting to, but I don't know how much you know about the PG&E lawsuit, but that's how they got more of it. Anyways, these registries allow individuals with disabilities or functional access needs, to sign up for a database, right? That emergency managers could opt into using that data to help plan, right? The whole thing is, though, is that these are voluntary. They're not mandatory in any way, shape, or form. There's generally no statutory language attached to it. So, one, it creates a false sense of reliance for people utilizing it, right? And then nobody knows what's going on in the back end. So how do we even know it's being beneficial? There are all kinds of data sets out there now, especially in the world we live in with big data, that could help planners at least establish a baseline for how many are transportation dependent, healthcare dependent, power dependent, right? To say, okay, this is what is in my community. And part of that process at the local level is that they have to do threat hazard risk assessments for each type of event, because it's not just natural anymore, right? Man-made. Cybersecurity is huge, right? How those events will impact your local geography, but even more specifically for vulnerable populations, what's going to destabilize their critical lifelines, right? What's needed for society to function is going to be different, because they do not have the same choices as you or I. And that is what we have to change and shift the narrative to truly build the resiliency for our most vulnerable populations. Did y'all want to say anything else about registries? No?
I guess as an alternative to registries, we've heard from some smaller parishes in Louisiana that they basically just have sort of a word of mouth via churches and communities and within the community about who might need specific kinds of assistance during disaster. These are smaller parishes where that's a possibility, and certainly they're still missing folks. But the level of trust that's there when you're talking about someone that you know and speak to weekly, and letting them know that, hey, if there's a storm, I will need power. If there's a storm, I will need someone who has a vehicle that can accommodate me in my wheelchair. Like those kinds of things. This is where I live. It's much easier to tell that to your neighbor than it is to put into a registry online where there's a huge banner at the bottom that says, "We will not help you, we are not liable. So give us your information, but we can't promise you anything, and we're the government also. So take that as you will," right? I think thinking about it differently and thinking about how to integrate community connections into preparedness is really important.
So all of that is a plug to say is that your P&A in your state should be one of your partners, even as a legal professional, for resources, for information, whatever it may be, because we serve all types of disabilities, right? So, and if we don't have maybe somebody specific on staff, we definitely have a network of people we could reach out to plug into as well. All right, next question. There's a lot of talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a lot of buzzwords going around, and everybody checking boxes that they say they're doing to address underserved populations and building that resiliency. Emergency program services and activities are considered a program and activity under Title, to ADA. So the obligation is to provide meaningful access. And in utopia, if we had a local jurisdiction that was providing everything that they should, and they had it all set up and ready to go, if the community doesn't know, it doesn't do a damn bit of good, right? So outreach and education is critical, right? And that's what we're here to help provide. As well as managing those expectations, because it is a disaster emergency. Things are going to slow down, things are going to happen. So my question to you guys, as far as outreach and education in the community and building that resiliency, what are you focusing on in y'all's areas? And Jordan, we'll start with you.
So I want to start with saying that I think organizations that don't typically serve people with disabilities don't often think about their also the access and functional needs community. And so that can be people with temporary disabilities or people with English as their second language. You could just be elderly or very low income. Those are all things that are barriers to your access to getting your needs met. And those folks to be included in sort of how you're doing your outreach and your awareness. Because just because you don't focus on, you're not a disability organization, you definitely serve people with disabilities or in the AFN community. And that is also a community that anyone at any point can join. Everybody in here has the potential to become disabled or temporarily or a part of the AFN community. And so I think thinking about that and including that in how you're doing your outreach is a huge start to making sure it is inclusive as it can be. Another thing that we focus on is when you're doing these materials, are they inclusive? I think people don't realize that plain language is a skill. Writing your materials in something that is simple that almost anyone can understand is hard. It's a skill, especially when we're talking about legal stuff. Like, how do you make that simple, so simple that anybody could get what you're trying to say? And an example, that's plain sentences, keeping your sentence short, your paragraphs short, using active voice. I just try to think if I was explaining this to a child, like how could anybody on any level, any age, understand what we're trying to provide and know that they can come get that help from us? I think I had one more other point, sorry. It's been a long night and I got in very late, so bear with me, please. And I'm also on West Coast time, so I'm all messed up. So yeah, and I just think understanding that it's going to vary what it looks like and understanding these communities and their different needs and taking it a step further to see what communities you serve, see if there's language needs there that aren't being met. When we post our YouTube videos from DRC, we have it not only in ASL, it's an audio description, so if you're blind, you know what's going on. And we have at least 8 to 10 different languages that we'll have it translated in. Just start, and then if someone comes to us and say, that language that I speak isn't there, we're gonna work on getting that there too. So it's just really trying to include as many people as you can by listening to who you serve and just seeing that, they're gonna have different needs, but those folks are definitely in your clientele, even if you're not focusing on that or realizing that.
Sarah?
I don't know that I have a lot to add to that, honestly. I'll ponder for a minute.
Okay, Brian.
Ditto to Jordan, just pretty much ditto. I would like to add kind of a shameless plug. Back when COVID first started 34 years ago, I was working for the Florida Department of Health, and I was also, as such, I was the state access coordinator with ESF6, which means which means I got to hang out at the State Emergency Operations Center for like a year and a half. And working with our state, local, and national partners on emergency preparedness and running the response and everything. When COVID first started, there was so much complex information coming from the CDC, coming from the National Institutes of Health, both of which were not in plain language, both of which were in very much PhD level public health speak. I'm not a PhD level. I work in public health, but no. So we were very fortunate, at least when I was at the state EOC, in trying to take that information and spit it back out in plain language and an easily understood format for people with disabilities and for people of all abilities. Really, we worked very closely with our Centers for Independent Living and I mentioned our 2 UCEDs, the 2 University Centers on Excellence and Disability. And we worked with them to create and provide guidance to Division of Emergency Management provide guidance and help them create plain language documents on this is COVID, on preparedness, on, these are the steps you need to take to stay safe because of COVID. And so give a shameless plug to our Division of Emergency Management a lot of the communication products that we spit out, a lot of the information that we shared was in plain language. Because we actually had people with disabilities and disability organizations at the state EOC. I know Kathy had mentioned earlier, during Hurricane Michael, she was invited into the mass care field. So during Hurricane Michael, we invited our Centers for Independent Living into the mass care field to also help with, communicating the needs of a disaster. But yeah, definitely what Jordan said, and just making sure everything is in plain language. Use pictures. Images are great, especially for people with like intellectual developmental disabilities, because we're going to have more public health emergencies. I hate to say that. Tying climate change into it, we're going to see more issues, more diseases and viruses show up that we're not used to dealing with.
Question about, you were just talking about while you were in your public health position. So those relationships that you developed, or the state developed with independent living centers, or did they have MOAs or MOUs in place, or was that just out of the kindness of their hearts?
I wouldn't say kindness of their hearts, more like, kindness of, we don't want Irma to happen again. But yeah, as far as there were no MOUs documented. They're working on that now at the local level. A lot of local emergency management agencies are working with their CILs to do something, to get something on paper.
So the QR code has a whole bunch of list of disability-specific resources, partners, agencies you could tap into if you're in this world, this line of work, and establishing those relationships. And we get that, emergency management is like herding cats. It's complicated. You're underfunded, understaffed like everybody else, but recognizing and having that humility to say, okay, we are not doing this. How do we fix that, right? And plugging into organizations that may be able to translate, whether it's different languages, plain language with that scientific background, or providing ASL videos, whatever it may be, you've got to start having these conversations at the local level based on your community needs, right? And ensuring that they have effective communication, meaningful access to sheltering operations, points of distribution, points of disembarkment, right? Sheltering operations have to also provide a continuity of care. I don't know how many survivors I've talked to who may have a mobility need or will need help with daily living skills or even a sensory need that did not evacuate because they said that sheltering operations would not accommodate their needs. They were willing to take that risk of dying instead of going to a sheltering operation. That defeats the whole purpose of having these things, right? So, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Nobody's asking for a Rolls Royce version. A good old Chevy will work, but we have to ensure people's health and safety. And you don't know how to do that until you're having those conversations beforehand in blue sky times, because once it's happening, you're not catching that grease pig after the event's happened. So, Sarah, did you think of anything to add to that as far as outreach and education?
Yeah, nothing groundbreaking, but I will say most of my clients find us through word of mouth, and I can say at some point my phone number was apparently the intake number, which is its own issue, but I can also tell you, based on that, most people are finding us word of mouth. So when it comes to thinking about how to make those community connections, we definitely, show up at community events or whatever else, but we as community members, as folks who are living and building those connections, making sure that we are also, ensuring that folks know that we exist and that we can provide these services, so that, for example, a client who's calling me a year and a half after a storm because they'd been a ping pong ball, like looking for 15 different organizations before someone finally said our name. I think thinking about that and intentional integration of information into the community is important.
I don't think we have enough time to go into that. So One last question for you guys, and I didn't put this on our little sheet, but what do you think is the most important or eye-opening thing you've learned since you've been doing this work? And Jordan, we'll start with you.
I think I need a second to think about that.
Brian, you ready? This is on the spot, you guys, so.
There's a lot. I guess I would say don't listen to the media when it comes to disaster. I mean, yes, watch the news and watch the weather and watch Mike's weather page on YouTube. Shameless plug. But as it relates to, there are a lot of good things that come out of a disaster. Make sure that they're inclusive of people with disabilities. But there is a lot of good that comes from a disaster. A lot of the volunteer hours, and you don't really recognize it until you've worked a disaster and you've worked the response. But there's a lot of good that comes out of it. A lot of partnerships are developed in that time that you can then build on afterwards moving forward.
Sarah?
I think something that's really stood out to me is the lack of communication between the various entities responsible for preparedness and recovery and the community. How siloed things can become, how 4 different organizations can be making the same effort to get something done and not know the others exist or are working on it. I think that's been, trying to find spaces where people are talking to each other and facilitate those spaces. And then, as Jordan said, making sure that people whose voice is important, who need to be there, are there and are also, California, Louisiana, compensated for their time being there and intentionally included in that planning. I think coming into this and trying to make connections as a new fellow, it became apparent that there were so many different avenues and that not all of them were connected. And that was a big problem in actually getting things done.
Jordan, you ready?
Yeah, I thought of something. I think for me what was eye-opening was I actually grew up in Florida, so my family survived Hurricane Michael, had a lot of damage and things and recovery. I learned firsthand from them in that sense. But I think now I lost my train of thought. Wow, I told you guys it was a long night. I had a point and then I lost it. So I think I'm just gonna let it go, sorry.
No worries. I've only been doing this work since Harvey, and I think, to me, we have to change the narrative in 2 ways, right? From the legal profession, this has to be something that we address with our clientele every day. Are you prepared, right? Because it is the reality in which we live. Man-made, natural, public health. It will continue to happen. Whether you believe in global warming or climate change, the reality is that it is, right? And then the other thing, as far as changing that narrative, we have to get better preparedness. It can't be, oh, well, it could have been worse, right? You survived. We've got to build the resiliency and put the political will behind making it a priority for our most vulnerable populations. And to do that, we all play a part. And we have to be willing to sit at the table and have these hard conversations and then sustain it too. So it's not just one and done, here's your training, here you go. That's just the beginning, right? Then the hard work starts with the day-to-day stuff. So that's my 2 cents. Sarah, did you think of anything else to add?
No.
Okay. All right, you guys, like I said, this QR code will take you just to a resource page of partners and specific disability information. We've got a couple minutes for questions if anybody has anything. I don't even know.
This one.
Yeah. Do we have a microphone?
So despite the fact that people with disabilities are living and ingrained literally within every aspect of society, We've sort of touched on the concept that data is often not stratified in a way to illustrate the needs that they have within every level of society. And we also sort of touched on, as it relates to meaningful access, Jordan especially, that concept of deliberate indifference, and also Sarah did as well. So I'm just wondering, how do you make those connections and overcome deliberate indifference in order to illustrate those needs of persons that you're assisting, and advocating on their behalf despite the data not being available to provide a visual for those that are at the level to sort of impact that change?
Anybody want to take first?
I'll try to answer that. From my public health background, one thing we noticed is the CDC does not include disability data on the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, YRBS. They never have. That's one action that needs to change. One way that we can address that is through policy. Things like pressuring or heavily encouraging the Florida Department of Health to add disability as a key demographic indicator on all of their local and state data products. They collect the data, they just don't display it equitably or easily. It's not easily accessible. So if you're a planner within the county health department, within Pinellas County Health Department, trying to figure out, okay, we're planning our shelters. I can't find how many people with disabilities live in Pinellas County. You need to be able to access that. So I think policy change can help with that. Absolutely.
Sarah?
I think there's some resources, even though there's not great data, there's some resources. Unfortunately, they tend to come after the fact, but the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies issues reports typically post-disaster that include a lot of qualitative data about folks with disabilities post-disaster. They had the report on Harvey and Maria is really interesting. The Civil Rights Commission, I think, uses that and has sort of community conversations or pulls from FEMA community conversations to put together reports as well. And so is using what there is to kind of build a narrative until there is a stronger set of data is one way to get things moving, because there are at least those independent mechanisms for collecting minimally stories about what's going on in these shelters and post-disaster generally.
And I'll add that you should try to look up what your state protection and advocacy organization is if you don't already know. They're not always going to be called disability rights, insert state name, so you're going to have to just Google that real quick to figure out which one it is that has that access authority, because they're going to probably be the experts in terms of this data. Like, that's all they're serving are those types of folks. So they might not have the data, let's say, in nice data sets, but they'll just have an idea because they work with those folks all the time. It can help you out that way. And I think, trying to find also community groups too. There's lots of folks, and most of those are led by the people with the disability too, because they haven't had any other sort of resources around that and organizing. So I really just try to go to the community, because again, like I said, they're the experts. They know what's going on. They know the issues. They've been doing this, dealing with this for their whole lives. So really tapping into their expertise and just using that to uplift their issues, and using your organization's power, your title as an attorney or whatever it is, to further their progress and things like that.
So I was going to ask a question, and Jordan just answered that, and I just want to echo that. Going to those groups that are already doing the work. So if your VOAD if you're not a member of your VOAD with your legal services group, you should be inviting those people to the table. In San Diego, we evacuated 500,000 people in 2007 after the fire. We ended up having a really big exercise for about 5 years to figure out why we failed so many people. So we reached out to the Alzheimer's Association, all the school districts in the county to find out which kids had autism and how we could have better planned what we did. And it was a really humbling exercise to go through that. I'm my VOED's chair there for that county now. And this is our focus this year, is pulling those partners in. So figuring out how to make yourself available to those independent living associations, your Alzheimer's group, your school districts that are doing that, the hearing impaired groups, the Center for the Blind. Just think of those different partners that are out of the box that you can bring in, because they're going to have the data. When COVID hit, we found out everybody without transportation, because we went to our government contractors who were providing normal medical runs for people without, and that's how we figured out who needed groceries and medications brought to them and all that. But you do have to think outside of the box.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to add another thing. You may want to check to see if your state provides services for people with disabilities. So in California, we have a state-funded Department of Developmental Services. So they provide folks with intellectual developmental disabilities, regional centers in each county that they're providing services that are tailored specifically for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And again, they're going to know, more data, more numbers, and also are great to partner with. I have an MOU with our Department of Developmental Services. We provide emergency preparedness trainings monthly, and so far we've served almost 1,000 people through those. And we're incentivizing that by getting Go Kits. And in this case, DDS got the funding from the state, and then they partner with me, and I provide the training. I actually lead the trainings. I came up with it, and we're just moving forward like that together to ensure that we're providing this information to as many people that need it. These folks are specifically people that live in high fire threat districts as well, because wildfires are a major disaster right now.
I'd like to add that too, one, it comes back to planning, right, and knowing your community. Obviously that deliberate indifference is because you don't know, you don't care to know, right? And while certain things may be funded because of a specific disability, the disability population is huge and covers. In Texas, we have 3 million plus people with disabilities, right? So understanding even a diagnosis and the functional implications is critical at that local level. And sometimes you just have to say it loud enough, long enough till somebody listens. But as attorneys, we also have that power. Okay, enough's enough, here we come litigation. But of course, that takes time, that takes resources, and it doesn't solve the problem. Even if I get a favorable opinion, we still have to be involved in the process and monitoring and collaboration, because it is fluid, it is ever-changing, and the needs are always going to change. But plugging into what is available at the local level is going to be key. So, anybody else have any questions real quick before we're done, kicked off stage?
All right, well, thank you so much to our panelists. We are going to take a 15-minute break. For those of you who didn't see, right across the hall, we have some popcorn and some sodas if you'd like to get some refreshments. And we will return at 3:45 for 2 sessions. The one in here at 3:45 is movement lawyering and the fight to end immigration detention. And in classroom A, we have Beyond Recovery, bridging the gap between community and disaster legal issues. See you in 15 minutes.